Have you ever been so excited for a game that you follow every piece of news leading up to it, watching all the trailers, joining forums and listening to dev interviews telling you about everything you'll be able to do, only to find out when launch day finally rolls around and you get your hands on it at long last, that it was all just hype and broken promises? Well, a recent rumour got me thinking about those games, and today we're going to be looking at 4 games that promised the world and just couldn't deliver. Number 4. Watch Dogs. Back at E3 2012, Watch Dogs was one of the darlings of the show, promising to be a true next-gen experience even before the PS4 and Xbox One had been launched, and showing off some of the best-looking graphics ever seen in a game, along with interesting ways to complete missions using your hacking abilities and a vast, exciting city to explore. Unfortunately though, Watch Dogs fell far short. The hacking mechanics ended up being far more simplistic than advertised, and most missions either funneled you down one particular way of completing the objective, or instead just ended up in massive shootouts, and that vast exciting city I mentioned turned out to be dull and drab, especially when compared to the other big game that came out just a few months earlier in GTA 5, which boasted a recreation of Los Angeles full of life and things to do to keep you occupied for hundreds upon hundreds of hours. All of that was bad enough, but it was the graphical downgrade that earns Watch Dogs a place on this list. The initial trailer that Ubisoft put out with Watch Dogs showed the game to look almost unbelievably realistic for the time, and as it turned out, it was unbelievable for a reason, as when we finally got our hands on this one, while it looked decent, it certainly wasn't what we were initially shown. According to Ubisoft, this was because the footage we saw at the reveal was recorded on a powerful PC, and that the PS4 and Xbox One just weren't powerful enough to match up. In itself, that could easily be viewed as a pretty dodgy business practice, displaying something that you know may not even be possible on the hardware you're putting it out on. Even if they didn't know the specs of the next-gen consoles though, Ubisoft could easily have assumed that they wouldn't match up to a multi-$1,000 PC. I mean, consoles are supposed to have mass market appeal, and there's no way that Ubisoft would have thought that Sony and Microsoft would build systems that would end up costing consumers thousands of dollars, because those consumers, a lot of them more casual gamers, just wouldn't have bought them. But even if you accept the excuse of, oh, it was all the hardware's fault, that doesn't explain why those options to make the game look the way it was meant to weren't available on the PC at launch. Modders have since found ways to make Watch Dogs look truly beautiful, but a lot of people felt deceived by this one, and while many other games have done this kind of thing, such as Aliens Colonial Marines, I personally think Watch Dogs was the biggest letdown when it comes to graphical downgrades, and that's why it's on this list. Number 3. The Fable series. Now, this is the game series that has brought this list to the forefront of my mind, with the rumours that a new Fable game may be in development, as the Fable series has consistently overpromised and underdelivered in the past, with the makers of the game Lionhead Studios founder Peter Molyneux being largely blamed in the gaming community's eyes, not just for these broken promises, but also on other games such as Goddess and Black and White. It has definitely been Fable though that's given critics the most ammunition when talking about potential broken promises. Fable was always supposed to be about the choices that the player made, and while you can see in the games that attempts were made to implement at least some sort of those choices and the effects that they'd have on the world, there are far fewer of them than players expected, and a lot of them had way less impact than they should have. Other promises that didn't come true, such as the infamous you can watch an acorn grow into a tree throughout the game, certainly didn't help redeem Fable in gamers' eyes. Now, listening to Molyneux speak about the Fable games, you can take away that this is just a man describing how he wants the game to be, and not someone telling barefaced lies, and that the ideas expressed for what would be in the game were simply held back by business decisions such as time allocation, or even just plain old money. At least that's one of the more generous ways of looking at the Fable series. It's always important to say as well that over the years Molyneux's worked on several great games, and some people would definitely include the Fable games on that list. Even if you loved the Fable games though, it's very difficult to argue that they're exactly what was promised, especially after apologies given to the fans for some of those missing features, and that's why the Fable games make it onto this list. The new Fable game that's been rumoured though has totally different devs, and we'll have to wait and see if they can make good on the original vision for the series. Number 2. Spore. This was a game that promised development of a species starting as a single-celled organism in a watery world before sprouting legs, climbing onto land and becoming the dominant species. And all along the way the player would make decisions about how best to evolve their creature to survive in its environment. A very Darwin-esque game design. Now, the game does let you modify your species and grow them to become more and more powerful, but the options are relatively limited, and the gameplay loop used to progress is utterly and mind-numbingly dull. Even the cell stage, which in my opinion is the most fun, is, when you look at it, just swimming around looking for food, attacking weaker organisms and trying to avoid the strong ones. Now, what was promised was a deep experience with fleshed out mechanics that would simulate the entire history of a species in a compressed period of time. Hell, the initial working title for the game was Sim Everything. What we got though was far too simplistic and shallow to live up to those expectations. Every phase of the game offered very little in the way of things to actually do, and while every time you reached a new milestone the game changed what it was significantly, such as the change up to an RTS at later stages, none of those changes were ever built on properly and ended up feeling like minigames rather than systems that developed off of each other to make a full experience. It's since been confirmed that the game was dumbed down to an extent to bring in more casual players. Now, it'd be unfair to just bash Spore and say it was a failure, because it did try a lot of new things and actually got a relatively good reception from critics, but we never got the game that everyone wanted and expected Spore to be. Number 1. No Man's Sky. Hey, you all knew it was coming. I mean, it's one of the most overhyped games of all time, and it undoubtedly failed to fully deliver. No Man's Sky was revealed at the VGX Awards in 2013, and immediately had a lot of gamers excited about the potential of the almost infinite universe that No Man's Sky promised. The 18 quintillion planets, alongside limitless variations of animals, plants, weather, and much more, seemed like a winning formula, and right up to launch gamers were expecting to be in for a treat, and a massive fandom had grown around the game before anyone even had their hands on it. So much so that death threats were sent to a journalist who so much as dared to speculate that the game would be delayed. Of course, he was later proved to be right on that, but hey, the number of assholes on the internet will never cease to amaze me. The game when it came though was a disappointment, and the phrase "as wide as an ocean but as shallow as a puddle" was thrown around a lot. Because sure, there were the quoted 18 quintillion planets, and yes, that is a lot of zeros, but there was basically no story, nothing to do, and once you've seen maybe 5 or 6 of those planets, you've pretty much seen them all. Now, a lot of people will tell you that gamers shouldn't have expected so much from this one, especially as such a small team at Hello Games worked on it. I, though, would say that the hype and hopes that gamers put into No Man's Sky was intentionally fueled by its marketing, and a lot of that comes down to Sean Murray and his many public appearances, including a now infamous interview that only lasted for 6 minutes that he did with Game Informer. So just for fun, let's quickly list all the things that were objectively lies from that interview. Not things that might be questioned or I think are subjectively wrong, but objectively lies. There are planets the size of Earth. You'll be able to play with your friends. There's a competitive element. You can grief other players. You can customize the look of your character. You can see other player characters and they can see you. You can land on a comet. All of that in a 6-minute interview. And remember, that isn't including the things that I think are wrong or untrue. Those are just objectively things that weren't in the game at launch. And people say they didn't break promises. Of course, I wouldn't want you to get the impression that that interview was the only deception. No, there were several public outings with this game that either had people saying things that weren't true, or even showing gameplay that looked nothing like what we finally ended up with. Promises such as planets orbiting and rotating on an axis, faction battles that you can join in with, and much more. But if you want all of that craziness, there are extensive lists out there. Now, it's important not to demonize anyone, and I fully believe that everything related to the No Man's Sky debacle started with the best of intentions. A team wanted to make an incredible infinite game that everyone could enjoy, but somewhere along the way, marketing and PR took over, and the game we got didn't have the features we expected. Instead, we got a boring mining and survival game that left most players thoroughly unsatisfied. Also, it was a buggy, unoptimized mess on PC at launch. The game has been significantly changed since then, but for many players it's just too late, and my hope is that No Man's Sky will serve as a lesson to other devs and publishers not to promise the world when you can't deliver. Anyway, that's about it for today. Let me know any games that you think could have made it onto this list. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, I'd be very appreciative of a like down below, and subscribe for more like this if you haven't already. Thanks for watching, I've been Nathan, and I'll see you next time.